Please enjoy this ad-free episode as part of our Academic Integrity series sponsored by Pangram Labs, the world's leading AI detection tool. Try it out at pangram.com. That's PANGRAM.com.
Welcome back, everybody. It's your time to EdUp on the EdUp Experience Podcast, where we make education your business. This is Elvin Freitas coming back at you with another Academic Integrity podcast series sponsored by Pangram Labs. And with me is my co-host, who is the most. He is Bradley Emmy. He's the co-founder and CTO at Pangram Labs. Bradley, how you doing today?
Oh, I'm doing great, Elvin.
Do it. Always good to have you here. Today we have a special one because we got two amazing guests today. So I'm going to try my best to get their introductions right. So we have Dr. Joseph Brown, and he's the director of the Academic Integrity Program at the Institute for Learning and Teaching at Colorado State University. And we also have Dr. Sarah Gutierrez. She's the assistant director for student conduct services at the Student Resolution Center, also at Colorado State University. Joseph, Sarah, how you guys doing?
Doing great.
Great, thank you.
Okay, awesome. Well, welcome to, thanks for being here. We appreciate it. So let's level set. We're going to start with you, Joseph. So tell us all about what you do and how do you do it?
Well, Elvin, Bradley, thank you so much for having us. This is a great opportunity. I've listened to the show, lots of great conversations. So happy we could be part of it. To your question, so directly speaking, when I direct the Academic Integrity Program at CSU, is a position I've held since 2016. I lead faculty development, and I advise senior leadership on building a culture of academic integrity, especially now in the AI era. From crafting policies to offering trainings, my aim is to make integrity a cornerstone of our educational community.
Fantastic. Sarah, your turn. What do you do? How you do it?
Hi, everybody. Thanks for inviting us to join. Very happy to be here. I am Joseph's counterpart that I feel like he helps support the faculty education. And then I'm the person who hears the conduct one-on-one with students at the university. So when I think of our office at the Student Resolution Center, we oversee all the types of conduct that can happen on the campus, from different types of alcohol and other drug behavior over into my academic integrity area as well.
And then Joseph, you also this year just joined the ICAI board, right? So could you tell us a little bit about that and what you're doing with them?
Yeah, no, thank you for mentioning that. So, obviously ICAI is an incredibly important organization, helping focus and develop efforts across higher ed, but also secondary education, around the idea of academic integrity. I've been involved with the institution, I think probably since 2017, in various, functions and roles. And this last year was, invited to apply for a board position, and saw that as a really important component to get back and serve this higher education community. So it's been a really interesting time. As you can imagine, institutions are very interested in what they can be doing to encourage academic integrity and, discourage inappropriate uses of these exciting innovations that we're seeing take place across the industry.
Yeah, thanks for that. And we have been asking everyone on this series, how do they define academic integrity? So we start with you, Joseph. How do you define academic integrity?
Yeah, so the phrase I like to use, especially with our faculty audience, is, we're talking about authentic engagement with learning. So that can look a lot of different ways. I think one of the challenges of this particular issue is that it comes freighted with all kinds of meaning that people are bringing to it, right? And sometimes those meanings can be really negative, right? Sometimes academic integrity has this kind of, it has this mirror image academic misconduct component. But what we want to focus on is the positive principle, right? The idea that this is something we want to encourage people to do. This is about growth and development. It's not a prescriptive thing of things you shouldn't do. That's such a bore. Everybody can't, we don't love those. That's not how we like to teach. And so this idea of we want to encourage authentic engagement, and that can look a lot of different ways. And I think that's one of the things that makes it so relevant and so alive for faculty, as they say, well, okay, that doesn't necessarily prescribe what I have to do in the classroom, right? Especially as these new technologies disrupt what we're doing, disrupt traditional notions of academic integrity. Well, in this formulation, active engagement, authentic engagement could look, a lot of different ways, and, can involve some of the very technologies that we're worried about.
Sarah, you would like to add anything to that?
I followed Joseph and Tilt, his office on campus, their definition of academic integrity. I'm certainly the more the more prescriptive side of the coin, thinking about academic misconduct in our office. And many of my conversations with students absolutely echo what Joseph brought up of how are they authentically engaging with coursework, thinking about the validity of their work and the reputation of the university. And really that question of, at the end of your university experience, what does that degree mean? What does that look like for you as we send you out as a Colorado State alumni out into the world and into these industries, and what that RAM name will mean to them in the future?
Fantastic. So it sounds like you both are very much like spirit of the law people and not like letter of the law people, which I think makes a lot of sense. I think that that's it always makes sense to kind of frame like the world that we want to see rather than like, oh, like don't do this, don't do that, because I mean technology evolves so much and if you try and like just like prescribe every single, rule and regulation that the students have to follow, there's always going to be like some loophole and some patch, something that you have to patch. So I think it makes sense to focus more on kind of the culture and have everybody, I love what you said too about like authentic engagement. I think that makes a lot of sense. So with that, like, I guess, how do you kind of, prescribe this culture? Like, how do you use that to kind of inform kind of the policies and the things that you actually write down as like the things that you're supposed to do and the things you're not supposed to do? And how do you kind of, Joseph, like, how do you advise faculty on creating these policies? And Sarah, like, kind of how do you communicate those policies to students?
Well, so I think the conversation starts with, the fact that people, when we're talking to the folks who are teaching these courses, we're talking about people who are passionate about their disciplinary areas, right? They're passionate about the content. No one really wanted to get into higher ed, but to become academic misconduct cop. They don't want to become the investigator of every single assignment. And so I think that, we start with the idea of what is it we're trying to accomplish here, right? And then we're moving towards that goal. And that's a very different goal than preventing cheating. And I'm not saying that's not important, because I do think we need to think about assessment design. Being smart about that, I think, is really important. And our faculty are along for that ride. But I think, helping people stay centered in this frame of what are you trying to accomplish when the semester is over and you don't see these students again, or maybe you don't see them again for another couple semesters in an upper division course. What is it you want them to take away from this class? Not, let's don't spend the whole semester telling them what they shouldn't do, right? So that's where we begin. And then really, so just to situate my unit in the higher education landscape. So TILT, or the Institute for Learning and Teaching, is a classic Center for Teaching and Learning, sometimes called CTLs or CETLs in higher ed. And so a lot of the work that we do is around faculty development. It's around course design. It's around assessment, right? And so we're really devoted to this idea that impactful learning is something you can study, right? Something you can encourage. And so that dovetails very nicely with the goals of academic integrity, which is like a really kind of an older idea, right? And it's a traditional idea in the sense of the liberal education and who we're trying to produce when we produce these graduates, as Farah so eloquently just stated. I mean, we're thinking about who we want these citizens to become, right? And we take that seriously as a state institution. So that could look a lot of different ways. And, just to kind of begin with, like, what do your assessments look like? I mean, how are you just figuring out if they've learned the things that you taught them? That's where we start, right? And so, as you can imagine, in this new environment, that's really overturned the apple cart, I guess, is the idiom, because now some of the more traditional assessments, the ways we assess that learning, value that learning, have been shown to be very difficult in this new landscape. And so that's really been an interesting moment, because now what the conversation has become is really about these outcomes. Okay, so the thing itself doesn't work so much anymore. What were the outcomes you were trying to achieve? And maybe we have to think more deeply about how we're going to get there. And it's not just a one and done assignment. Maybe it looks really different than what you thought, or maybe this is an opportunity for our faculty to learn, right? And so we try to embrace that. So I'm going to pause there and just kick off to Sarah, because I know she has a lot to really add to this conversation as well.
Yeah, thank you. Now, we definitely piggyback, I feel like, off of one another, Joseph and I, as we think about building this culture of academic integrity and helping both faculty and our students on campus try to understand, why do policies exist and how do we move with them? And then, yeah, that changing landscape of technology and what that means for our students. I think the fun part for our office is trying to figure out, student conduct offices, we tend to be reactive, right? Something has happened and then we're making a response. And I think, the past couple of years, we've been trying to shift that to think, how do we be more proactive? How do we get out in front of students? And we've been doing that through tabling, whether it's orientation with thousands of new students coming in and having our fun prize wheel and educating them on some of the policies. I think of strategically how we can partner with the library and resources like our writing center so that we can be a little more on the front end of how we interact with students and recognizing that, yeah, even though we have student conduct within our office and literally in my job title, helping students understand we're really focused on the educational aspects of how do we help students understand policies, how do we help them understand being part of this bigger community and being authentic and hopefully excited and engaged within their academics, more so than just, we're a principal's office or we're here for trouble and that type of follow-up. Just trying to be a more of a wraparound service for students in that way.
Oh, definitely. And like that's one of the biggest like takeaways that like I've learned from, running this series and talking to so many experts in academic integrity, that like the proactive part is like so much more important than the reactive part, because like a lot of the problems, can be solved kind of upfront. And when you actually create this buy-in, because we know that like students engage in academic misconduct like when they're not bought in, like when basically they're like, oh, like, this is stupid, like I don't buy into what my professor is teaching me and I don't believe in this. So creating this environment where students like really feel empowered, like, okay, like I'm in charge of my own education and I'm bought in to the education that this professor is offering me. That's kind of like what creates this kind of, harmonious environment, so to speak. Um, on the flip side, like I was actually just on Friday, just talking to this very disgruntled professor who's teaching online education, and it's online general education too. So it's just like this requirement that like all of these freshmen have to complete, and like many of them are not bought in. And he's like, listening to our series, he's like, listening to academic integrity best practices, and he's like, no matter what I do, like no matter how fun I try and make the class, how fun like I try and make the assessments, how fair I make everything, he's like, I feel like my students are always just like they're so not bought in that they're always just trying to cheat, and like I can't close every single loophole. And he was just very like he was just venting out, very frustrated with the state of things. So maybe like Joseph, like if I were that professor, like coming into your office, like all my students are trying to cheat, I have no idea what to do. How would you go about like kind of framing an intervention and like kind of helping that professor kind of turn his culture around?
Yeah, I love that question. So, Bradley, let me begin by saying these are my people. So, I was an English professor before I took this position, and I've lived that life. And while my landscape was really different, at that time, the challenges did not look like this, right? It was more traditional plagiarism and that sort of thing. What I can bring to those conversations is really kind of I begin by just listening and empathizing with what they're going through, because I do want to point out the AI thing is just the most recent in a long line of severely disruptive, mostly technological innovations that our faculty have been managing. I mean, and then you throw a global pandemic in the middle of that, right? um, so so our current crop of faculty have seen some stuff, and they have the battle scars. So I want to begin by just saying that is real. And then, but what you're also hearing in that wariness, I think, is the desire they wish it were better, you know? And my former colleagues, some of them I talk to every day. We have this long running WhatsApp chat that allows us to hear like what's going on in their world. And that feeling that you just described is very real, especially as it involves online education. And I think that one of the first things I would say is like, let's take a step back, right? Like, let's do kind of try to inhabit what the student experience is like right now. It's been a long time since we were students, but like imagining that this magic wand, which essentially is what this is, right, for student work, just fell in your lap, right? As a student, this is such a disruptive moment for you because while you're working hard, and let's be clear, no matter where you go, higher ed work, college work, it is hard, right? Then there's this kind of like, this little whisper every time you're working hard. Yeah, but you could just hit the easy button. And that is so, I don't know that I would have been a great student in that environment. I don't know about the decisions I would have made in that environment. So let's just begin by like understanding what we're asking them to do is really hard too. Okay, so then the question is, what do we do about that course, right? So this conversation actually happens, I would say happened a number of times over the summer. Faculty came to me and they're like, okay, I spent the first 3 years of this trying to banish AI from my classroom to encourage academic integrity and really focus on their learning. And it was kind of a disaster. And I need to make peace with the landscape the way it is. So how do I do it? So like the first thing I talk to faculty about is just, number one, this is messy, And so right off the bat, we have to look at what we can, what is absolutely the most important thing that we must maintain, right? The thing that we can't let go of, or else we're not teaching anymore. And that might look different for every discipline, every different faculty member, right? But then there are things that we probably need to just get comfortable letting go of. So like, for example, when I first started in higher ed, you would assign books in a course. I mean, the internet was still there, right? I mean, like Google was a thing. I mean, it wasn't that long ago, right? But you assign materials and mostly students learn from those materials. Now we know they learn in just vastly different ways, right? So one of the things we have to give up is the idea that we control the learning environment, like all the things they're going to learn about the subject, that they're actually going to direct their learning. And they're probably going to use AI and they're probably going to use Google and everything else, right? Because that's the way they've learned to interact with their world. And we're not, the shorthand for this, I tell people, you're not going to be there to slap it out of their hand in the dorm room, right? You're not. So we have to let go of some of those things. So as a writing professor, one of the example I give is outlining. I tried for years to get my students to outline. They don't want to do it, right? And that's frustrating to me. And I can make them do it. I can make them turn it in. Well, now, one of those things I can let go of is outlining. Say, okay, if you're going to use this technology to outline a potential assignment, and that outlining is kind of where that's one of those steps. You now see the value in a pre-writing process. I can live with that, right? The line for me is where, you can't use that then to create a better assignment, right? That it's generating out for you. You at some point, show me where you did the work, right? So, I think, the last part of this is just essentially acknowledging that then we have to redesign our courses. We have to look then with those decisions we've made, the things that we have to let go and the things that we're going to keep, we're going to have to redesign the course along an assessment, assessment regime where AI is going to be part of some things. And then we have to have really good reasons that we communicate to students why it can't be part of others, right? But now after doing that exercise, like we have a better way of talking to students about why it has to be that way. And I think one of the things, and just to wrap up here, I will say like one of the things that this allows us to do now is, I guess, approach one of the weaknesses of higher education, and particularly at a course level, that has just historically been there, which is like we got to get really good at talking to our students about the value of what they're doing at the class level, because the class you just described, I think, is a case in point, right? General education courses, right? For many students who are like, yeah, but I really want to be a physical therapist or a nurse, so why am I taking Comp 1, right? And it's like I want to have that conversation with you, but we have to get really good at helping them see the value, and then helping them see why that course creates value for them in the future, which will help them as they prosecute their career.
Right, for sure. And like maybe that intervention is like one step back even further. Like it's like, why are we requiring general education classes for physical therapists? Like maybe like in the age of AI, or like, in the age of like technological change, like maybe like some of the classes that we force students to take before like don't need to exist anymore potentially. And these are like, also, kind of interventions that we can stage too. When we're thinking
Well, I'm
about
a
like
liberal
what is
arts
the
guy,
value
so
of our education. Yeah.
So I'm sorry. I was going to say I'm a liberal arts guy. So I'm going to tell you that has incredible value. Talk to any nurse, any physical therapist. They're going to talk to you about the writing they have to do in a given day and like the real stakes if their writing is unclear. Right. And so, and while AI does impact some of that landscape, and we're just now figuring out how, I think the idea of like, when we go back to the idea of integrity, right? Like one of the many definitions of that word is wholeness. Right. And really, if you look at the way it's particularly a state university like Colorado State tries to produce those graduates that we think enrich the world, is through this idea of a whole citizen, right? That knows something about physical therapy, but also about philosophy. And so I think that those things we've always seen as complementary. And for us to give that up, I mean, I can tell you, our faculty would not be in favor of that a kind of a radical approach to it, because we see the value in the way it enriches our communities.
Oh, for sure. And I think it's like really important to just like be holding these conversations with students at all, rather than just like kind of like pretending like that these conversations don't exist, right? Like, I mean, like I think like, it like so many students now, like, I mean, like are just thinking like, okay, like, is it even worth it to go to college in the first place? And so like it's kind of also the role of the university to convince these students that like, hey, there's a lot of value in learning philosophy and learning liberal arts. And that's going to serve you well in your career long term. And I think like, we shouldn't just assume that our students like come into college like already being bought into that narrative, but like we need to be able to convince our students that like this is real.
Yeah, and keep in mind, we're not the only ones having those conversations. Sarah is having those conversations too in those hearings.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, to loop Sarah into this, like kind of like what are you kind of hearing from students on kind of like when you kind of bring them in to stage these kinds of interventions, like what are kind of the reason? Could you just like kind of give us a little bit of perspective into like the mind of these students and like what's going on with their motivations?
Absolutely. Yeah. When I talk to students, we have really interesting conversations because I'm not a faculty member. So when something has happened, I tell the student that, hey, listen, it's me. I'm a staff member. I'm part of the student affairs division. So the other side, right? If we've got our academic partners, we've got our student affairs partners, and letting them know this isn't my class, this isn't my topical subject area. And I hope that opens the door for just a more open and honest conversation with the student. And I do. I ask them all kinds of probably nosy questions about, what AI platforms are you using? Why did you choose that one over this other one? And did you know we have access to this? And just trying to understand some of the mindset about why they decide to use what they do. And Bradley, hands down, the number one reason that students are engaging are in some type of academic misconduct has to do with time management. It's 2 in the morning. I'm working on this paper. I can't email the professor at 2 o'clock in the morning. So having conversations of, well, what led you to get to the place that it's suddenly now 2 in the morning and the paper's due at 8 and you can't reach out for help. So of course you're doing some typing on the computer and using, like Joseph said, some outside resources, whether it's AI, the number of students that are self-teaching in a way from YouTube videos, especially if maybe English isn't their first language, to have access to someone who speaks your language and can teach you about a concept that as I hear this, I'm like, oh, I get it. That makes so much sense to me. And how does that fit within the policy types of conversations with students? But I think it's difficult with faculty, right? I think I can empathize so deeply with them, with how frustrating it is of there is no way to like cheat proof a class or an assignment or really anything that they're putting out in the classroom. So being able, like Joseph said, to listen, to empathize with them, to ask questions and try to get creative and like, well, what are our options here? What does it look like to lean in? And then talking with the students to understand, what led you to this decision? And I love to ask them, if you had an opportunity to sit here with your professor for the class, what would you want them to know about your experience? And it's almost always, I'm not a cheater or I'm not a bad person. And so having those conversations with students to recognize, like, I'm not labeling your behavior as bad per se, but if you did make a bad decision, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're a bad person or you're a bad member of our university. It just means you made a decision at a point in time with the information you had. So trying to guide the student through understanding the why and some of the impact. And if there's harm done in the relationship with that professor, how can we help heal and restore some of that so that they can stay here and graduate and move off into the community?
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, I think like time management is also not always kind of like the underlying like root cause of things either. Like a lot of times it's like, oh, like, I actually just didn't feel smart enough to complete this assignment. And it was easier for me to use ChatGPT than admit that vulnerability to my TA or my professor that like, oh, like actually I really needed some support and some help. in completing this assignment. And so like, getting students to kind of open up is I think a big part of like kind of trying to get to that understanding and
Oh, yeah.
trying to uncover often like what is like the root cause of what was going on. And I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir. Like I'm sure you know this
Oh,
and deal with this every single
yeah,
day.
Bradley, I can't tell you how many times I used AI because I wanted my paper to sound smarter. I wanted it to help me use better language. And so trying to figure out how do we connect these students to resources that we have. We have a fabulous writing center and Tilt, they offer fantastic tutoring opportunities for students. And so many times they're like, oh, I didn't know that. So just helping them slow down and identify, let's look at what's out there so that maybe the decision looks a little different in the future.
Yeah, for sure. And like there's like different variants of this same sentiment. Like students like they look at the AI output and they're like, "Oh my gosh, like this is so much better than like anything that I could produce on my own." So like I don't feel like trying because it's like, "Oh, like the AI is just going to do a better job than me anyway." And when, I enter the workforce, I can just like offload this stuff to AI. So like kind of what kind of language do you use to talk to these students about like, okay, like, like you still have value as a person, and your work has value, um, even if like the AI can do is very capable and can do a lot of things that humans used to be able to, used to be able to perform at, right? So like, how do you convince students that like, okay, like you do have power and like your work is valuable, even though there is like this superhuman AI assistant that's now available to everybody?
Oh, that's $1 million question right there. Absolutely. I think recognizing, what language the student is using, like one of them said, I wanted my work to sound more scholarly. And so there was
Mm,
a conversation with that student of, listen, you're a member of this university and you made it through your K-12 experience. You made it through the college admission process and you are here. So the very fact that you are here with us on campus, whether it's in person or online, to let them know you are a scholar and you now get to wear and own that title for yourself. So helping build that confidence and recognizing like, well, maybe you don't feel confident in your writing, but what is something in your life, in your world that you feel confident in? And how can we tie that back? So it's a little bit of almost a psychological type of academic conversation with the student, just so that they can see, just because you're not great at something yet doesn't mean that you're not going to get there. So really focusing on that power of yet and helping resource them so that we can get them to that healthier type of thinking place about themselves.
Yeah, definitely. And Joseph, like kind of going back to like original like definition of academic integrity, which is like authentic engagement, like that actually could be an authentic way of like using ChatGPT or AI. Like if the student produced an essay by themselves, and then like they were just like at the end, like, oh, like I just wanted a little bit of help to like make the language sound a little bit more scholarly, then like that actually could be an indication that they are like authentically engaging with the material, right? So kind of like how do you train your faculty to tell like whether or not like because they just see the essay and they're like, oh, like this has a rich tapestry of like endless complexity, and then they flag it off to Sarah's office. So how do you kind of like get faculty to kind of tell when or whether or not the engagement with AI is authentic?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the approaches now that we're starting to kind of coalesce around have to do with just showing your work, right? And like helping us understand why you went to an AI engine, right? To some of these chat bots while you were in the middle of your assignment, right? If that's what you did, then just help us understand what came next. And I think there are ways to structure assignments where you can encourage kind of a responsible use. That's really what we're trying to kind of move towards, but that's a process model, right? And I think that takes some assessment design to build that in because it's not going to happen on its own. Certainly not on the students. They're not going to spontaneously do that. And I think then I think just taking a step back to what we were just talking about was like we are really becoming outcome driven. And I think this is exacerbating, like, AI is exacerbating that particular component. And look, part of this is just endemic to higher ed because ultimately it funnels to a degree and a degree funnels to a position, right? And that funnels to a salary and a lifestyle that you were envisioning for yourself. And all of that is good. And I think to a point of good and healthy because we need to be motivated, right? We know how humans work, right? So like, I think when I think about, the way that the assessments that are really working right now are about valuing growth and then communicating that to a student. So like one of the things, look, I still teach. I teach in our honors program here, and one of the things I tell them, these are very, very accomplished students, they who operate at a very high level of work. But one of the things I tell them when I see some of these technologies making their way into their work, or I see this kind of insecurity that Sarah is describing, student that they bring to those decision makings, I say, look, I'm interested in teaching you, right? And that struggle, and that's maybe a word we don't use a lot in education, but like the struggle that it takes to produce something that is not awful is like that's a valuable moment for a student. And honestly, one of the moments that's even more valuable is when you fail, right? And you learn why. And you're held accountable by whatever grade, but then you're told through feedback what it was that didn't work and why, right? And I think that if these tools allow a skipping over of that moment. And so ultimately, I think those of us who are very worried about AI's just eruption into higher ed and the embrace of our institutions of this technology without really thinking through it, is this idea that we're kind of like we've got this like kind of frictionless experience for students where failure isn't really part of it. And I know that none of us like to fail. Like that's a challenge just emotionally. But like we build in failure in a course, right? So that it happens in small ways so that ultimately you succeed, right? And there's something really healthy about that. And it goes all the way back to whenever you were, when you were a child and you were learning like really basic stuff. And so I think that we need to get better at describing that and like what's going on behind the scenes of these courses so the students aren't so failure resistant. The explanations that Sarah hears, for example, in those conduct hearings, I mean, that's human stuff. Like, and in some ways I'm like, I wish we could have those conversations in the classroom before you end up in a hearing space, because I could tell you things like, hey, you know what? I get 18 of these essays on a Monday morning. If I get 17 and I get yours tomorrow, I'm good with that. So yours being late, not a huge deal to me. A lot of faculty are going to work with you, right? But there's something about, the undergraduate mind where they're like, no, it's a due date. It's got to be done that day. I don't feel like having that conversation with that guy or whatever, interacting with humans is painful. Those sorts of things play into those kinds of decision making, the moments that lead us towards this path of just like, landing a student into a conduct hearing. So I think, that can look a lot of different ways. Like faculty can do a better job of denoting like, hey, I'm approachable. You can talk to me about things when they're happening, right?
Hey,
and
kids,
I say that
you can talk to me.
you're right. Right. Turn the chair around and hey guys, let's wrap. But I think but realistically, just letting them know, I get it. You're human. I'm a human. These things happen. Let's talk about them when they do.
Yeah, and I mean, I think like you talk to every writing instructor, they would much rather have like the unpolished essay that's a more authentic like reflection of like the student's ability and their thought process than like that same essay with like an AI slop coat of paint on it. Like definitely like that's not like making the work actually sound better or more scholarly. It's really just kind of like just remixing it in this kind of like meaningless way. Um and often making it worse too. Like I think like for sure. Um I would like to hear more about kind of your take on like the kind of like outcome culture, because I feel like that stands in direct opposition to like being okay with failure, right? Like it's like, okay, like a student feels that like the essay that they turn in has to be the absolute best thing that they can produce with or without the help of AI. Because for them, it's like, okay, like I need to get an A in this class because I need to get this job that pays this salary, and I need to, and a lot of times it's like I need this job to support my family, or like, or for any other number of like very serious legitimate reasons. And so like kind of like how do you kind of like bring back like being okay with failing into this more like kind of like outcome driven environment that's kind of been created over the last recent times?
Well, I think it begins with, I mean, in a course, embracing a process model for the work. I mean, one of the things we talk a lot about at our Institute for Learning and Teaching is like, even in, obviously as a writing professor, that's something we've been doing for a really long time. But in other disciplines and professions, this is becoming more difficult. Like it's a new conversation. And so I think by saying, hey, the end result is the result of a process that you did, right? And that moves us away from the kind of one and done outcome assignment, right? Like the 4 essays and you're done with the semester kind of situation. Like, so that can look really, really different. But I do think that like your question about, outcome culture, this is real. College is very expensive no matter where you go. And there, look, time equals money in the sense that when you have to slow down, right, it's costing you more the longer it takes. And that is a very real, thing that encourages students to, to move forward very quickly. And I think that can stand at odds with the way education is designed right now. Because I mean, look at that. It's a 16-week semester, right? That's not ideal in anyone's timeline, right? A 4-year diploma program. I mean, the idea of a bachelor's degree in 4 years. I mean, we're in a culture where why isn't it in 18 months, right? But the reason we design it that way is because of some really good time-tested, data-driven, evidence-based reasons, right? That it takes, for some things, it just takes time to learn, right? And that may look really different depending on whatever your program of study is. And so I think, I'm thinking about the things that I would recommend to higher ed administrators in this kind of space, right? Is like, insisting upon encouraging, funding, developing approaches that are process driven, because then that communicates back to students that while you may have failed on part 1 and 2, you got it by part 3, right? And when you get it, you typically get it forever, which is a pretty amazing thing when you think about it, right?
Right, and we should
so,
give that student credit for that too. Like we should give them an A.
Absolutely.
Like, yeah.
Absolutely. And I think, some assessment, design that values growth and not just the rubric at the end, it's marking it up as we make our way through. So I think that's another approach that would be really helpful, is about seeing that growth from the beginning of the semester to the end of the semester, and figuring out ways to how a student earns that being how a student earns their grade in your course. And I know a lot of faculty listening to are like, oh my gosh, I've been doing this for years. What is this guy talking about? But this is not one of the things that I think, like this has been 9 years for me at this institution. One of the things I've learned is that departments don't talk to each other. Disciplines do not cross hatch their ideas together. And so like, it's really interesting to hear them then go, okay, wait, we've been doing this for 20 years in writing instruction, but this is maybe a new thing in biology. Right. And so I think that just saying it in this space is really helpful for people to hear, like, oh, maybe I need to be thinking about ways I can build that process in.
Yeah, absolutely. So like, I mean, you kind of think that like the outcome culture, like this is just kind of like inevitable, and it's just more of a matter of kind of aligning incentives so that the process of learning is just more aligned with kind of the outcomes that students are expecting.
Well, outcome culture makes it sound negative, and and I guess maybe there are parts of me that want to. I mean, that's the reality of the situation. But I do think that human beings need to be incentivized, right? Look, we don't have an unlimited amount of time, and this is most of our students come to the university at a point in their lives where they're just really trying to get on their feet, and then like that, there are financial consequences to that as well. So I think those are real, and I think that that's okay. That's motivating for people. But I also think that there's a reason that this is an opportunity to explain why the program looks the way it does. And I think that when you get that, you get buy-in from students, and they go, okay, the reason it takes that long is because of this. And then you help them see the connection to how that will connect to their career. What I worry about, again, getting back to this idea of wholeness, right, is that when they're too outcome driven, and when that forces some poor decision making, then what happens, the worst case scenario is you get into a profession you are unprepared for. And so years ago, I did the conduct hearings for the university years ago, and I love those conversations with students, and because some amazing things can happen in really small moments. And I remember one specific involved a student in participation points, and he said, "Why is this a big deal? Like this is like literally just a few points." And I said, "Hey, you know what? I'm actually going to like reinforce what you're saying in this moment. Like it is a very small amount of points right now. Like the impact to you right now is very small. Okay. But what you're doing is you're asking someone to click in for you. Like let's jump ahead 6 years. Okay. You're asking someone to sign in for you at work or to write your name on the finished project. Okay. And let's jump forward just a few more years. And the impact is you get caught, and maybe it's just you, and it stinks at work for a little while, or you have to go find another job. But a few years later, maybe there's a family who depends on you, right? People in your life who need to know, like you're coming home happy, and you're you're doing well at work and you're bringing home a paycheck, right, that they can count on, then the impact is significant, right? And I think that helping people see getting a group of people who frankly are thinking very short term, thinking long term, that benefits everyone.
Oh, absolutely. And there's so much chatter now about like, oh, like, what's the value of the liberal arts education? Like, let's just teach people how to be like electricians or like plumbers or whatever. But like, I mean, I feel like this misses the forest for the trees, and that like these are 18-year-olds. Like they come into college and they like really have almost no idea what's going on or what they want to do with their lives. And like part of the value of this education is really like kind of helping them engage in that self-reflection and helping them figure it out. And so like, I guess to get on my soapbox a little bit, like I do think that like, a lot of times like, the things that they study in class don't have to be like directly tied to the job or the salary that they're going to get right after they leave school. A lot of it is just kind of instilling these educational values and, helping students really reflect and figure out what they want to do. And like, I think, yeah, like helping students like get a little bit more long term and be like less narrowly focused on like, oh, I need to get an A+ in this class. Otherwise, like my life is a failure. I feel like anything that we can do on the academic integrity side to encourage that kind of reflection and growth, I think is absolutely spot on the right approach.
No, I always love it when you get on your soapbox, Brady.
Get so excited,
You always have good insights.
Everyone
Okay.
thinks of academic integrity as like so negative a lot of the time. It's just like no cheating, and I feel like there's actually so much value that practitioners can provide.
Oh, 100%, 100%. Great conversation as always. We're coming up on time. So you know what? I'm actually going to start with Dr. Sarah Gutierrez. I'm going to start with you, Sarah. So what do you see as the future of academic integrity? And then we'll go to Joseph.
Oh, such a great question, Elvin. I think as we think about the future, it's about how, what Joseph was saying, how do we evolve and what does this look like? And something you said earlier, Joseph, that I'm still thinking about is this idea of best practices and recognizing that like best practices are not the best forever. So we're constantly changing and evolving. And I think, as we watch AI and the way that it's growing and learning, and AI detection growing and learning, and watching this almost technology arms race going on, I think it'll be a challenge in both good and some hard ways too, right? For us as institutions to figure out how do we want to handle this? How do we teach our students to be responsible stewards of information? And Bradley, I heard you saying, this offloading of, well, I'm going to use it in my job. I'm like, heck yeah, they probably are going to use technology in their job. So how do we teach them how to ethically use tools and how to still build? I don't want them to lose their critical thinking skills. So how do we have a both and situation? I want you to know how to use these tools. I want you to know how to use them critically and be able to think about that and how you might do things differently. And even now, some of the students, they say, I want to be a teacher. And I'm like, all right, I want to hear, how would you tell your 5th grade class about using AI? And what would that mean for you as a teacher? So just helping expand that mindset. And for us as educators, yeah, the future is this challenge of how are we going to integrate this? How are we going to grow? Where are some of those pushback points too?
Yeah, awesome. What are your thoughts, Joseph?
Oh, I love what Sarah said there. I take all of that to heart. I think that's a great place to start. I wanted to say, like, I've had the benefit of listening to y'all's podcast and preparing for our conversation. And I know that higher education leaders listen to what you have to say. I love the level of engagement that y'all had. So I think what I want to say is to those leaders who are listening, how we learn is probably changing, right? And how we talk about student development, their development as learners and complete citizens, that is going to have to evolve, right? I mean, I do want to just point out that, like, there was a time the book was a disruptive technology, right? We had memorized things, right? And the book came along and obliterated our memory for memorizing lines of poetry. And suddenly, that changed things. And there was a messy middle for about a century or two while we got used to the idea that our memory was getting worse. But what we got instead was access, right? We got access to all of these new stories and ways of thinking and new ideas. And that was a benefit for humanity. Right now, we can't quite see what's on the other end of this messiness. So I think the first thing that I would say is let's acknowledge this is really difficult, especially for this generation of faculty, teachers, and learners, right? And let's approach this with just some humility that we don't have all the answers, that we can't see how it's going to end, but that we're going to try to do our very best as we make our way through. The first thing I would say is, I think some real deep thinking at the institutional level of what problem is your academic integrity process or program designed to solve, right? So some programs across the higher ed landscape are designed to solve the problem of we have a lot of cases of academic misconduct. We have to get rid of them all, right? That's not the right problem to solve. The right problem to solve is we have students who are not completing their work authentically, right? We want them to be authentically engaged with their own learning, to have that sense of ownership and to learn from the things they're doing here, right? The other thing I will say is that when we look at all the research around academic integrity, and this has been borne out over decades, it's actually pretty remarkable how consistent it is. Students show up to our campuses with a kind of checkered background of like how they've approached things in high school. A lot of it's very norm dependent of like the culture of the school they came from. But when they come to our campus, this interesting thing happens where they look around and they're like, what's going to fly here? Like what's okay here? Your institution should have a clear answer for them. You should find out if you do. If you don't, it's time to start giving them one, right? And early, because that is a real opportunity that many institutions are missing, right? So maybe it's something as simple as we have an honor code. Let us talk to you about it, right? Hey, this is written, this principle is really important to us, and we put it on a wall somewhere. We want to talk about why, right? And so maybe that happens at an institutional level, and maybe you encourage it at a class level, but have some answer for them when they show up this fall, or if this is too late, next fall.
Yeah, I love this conversation about authenticity. I think it's been great, and it just made me think about the institutions should also be authentic, right, and transparent in what they do. So I think that is a great insight. All right, amazing conversation. Let me outro my co-host, who is the most. He is Bradley Amy, CTO and co-founder at Pangram Labs. Bradley, thank you as always.
Oh, this is always so much fun. Thanks for having me, Elvin.
Absolutely. Love the insights. Get on the soapbox anytime you want, Bradley. So I want to outro my guest today. We have Dr. Joseph Brown, and he is the director of the Academic Integrity Program at the Institute for Learning and Teaching TILT, right, at Colorado State University. Thank you so much for being here, Joseph.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely. And we also have Dr. Sarah Gutierrez, and she's the Assistant Director for Student Conduct Services at the Student Resolution Center, also at Colorado State University. Sarah, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you, Alvin. Thank you, Bradley. Thanks, Joseph.
Absolutely. And so with that, ladies and gentlemen, you've just EdUp'd.
Thank you for listening. This episode is part of our Academic Integrity series sponsored by Pangram Labs, the world's leading AI detection technology. Try it out at pangram.com. That's PANGRAM.com.